That I've ever seen.
And of course, I'm talking about Senator Bernie Sanders, who is running neck and neck with former Secretary of State Hillary Clinton there for the Democratic nomination. And I like watching him speak. I saw him on CNN this last week. I think he really believes what he believes. I like him personally. We'd probably get along very well. The poor guy's losing his voice at points because he's speaking so much. But every time I listen to him talk, I hear him say things that I go, well, that's true. And I guess I have to put my own comma but in here. If you put it in context, what you're saying doesn't make sense in terms of how it's put out. So I thought I would take a 5-minute interview with CNN that Senator Bernie Sanders did recently. They asked him how he was going to pay for all of these goodies that the Sandman is promising us we're going to get for free, remembering that free things sell. And my son tells me that he's doing very well on college campuses right now. He's very popular because, well, free for everything. Okay, now you have to keep this in mind. The country is now marching towards a $20 trillion debt. And very little do you hear that mentioned in the debates. They're acting, especially on the Democratic side, they're acting like it doesn't exist, like this can go on mounting forever with no ramification. A third of everything that we are spending today, government-wise at the federal level, is borrowed. We're literally running up this debt clock at just a breathtaking rate. And we're promising more goodies, even as Obamacare itself is teetering. So let's jump into this and we'll make some commentary as we go.
Great question, and a very fair question. And I start off with the premise that in the last 30 years, although my Republican friends don't like the term, there has been a massive redistribution of wealth in this country. It's gone from working families, trillions of dollars, to the top 0.1%. So yes, what this campaign is about is to say to profitable corporations who in some years don't pay a nickel in taxes, to the wealthiest people in this country who sometimes have an effective tax rate lower than truck drivers or nurses, yeah, you are going to start paying your fair share of taxes.
So Senator Sanders here frames the issue. He says there has been a redistribution of wealth, and I do agree with him as far as that has gone. I've talked about it many times here on the program as to exactly what happens in environments where there is high tax and high inflation. A few people at the top succeed in bubbling up and capitalizing on the ravages caused by inflation, but that the middle class is totally devastated by it and slides downward, and that includes the working class, until you wind up with a giant puddle of have-nots at the bottom. He's right about observing what has happened, but he is wrong about observing the cause. And that's important because if you don't know what's wrong, you can't fix it. Second thing, redistribution of wealth. Well, jeepers, isn't that what Democrats have been pushing for ages? You mean it went the wrong way? Oh, funny that. Who could have imagined that that was the way it was going to go? Well, anybody who understood the mechanisms told you what was going to happen, and indeed, it has happened. So why are we surprised? Now, he's right. He talks about the corporations not paying tax. Why? Because they've located themselves offshore so that they don't have to pay tax here, because we have one of the highest, I think it's the highest, corporate income tax rate in the world. So corporations, people that invest in corporations, are taxed at two different levels. They're taxed, first of all, on the income to a C corporation. The corporation pays the tax. Although remember, the corporation never really pays the tax. They fill out the forms and they write the check, but their customers pay the tax. And then the investors into that corporation actually pay on the dividend collection coming out of that corporation. So that's the second thing. So he's right about that. But even if you just tax the corporations blind, it wouldn't do anything to solve our mounting deficit and debt problem. You always need a middle class to be shackled with this. Now, when he talks about the wealthiest paying lower than, the taxi driver, that's because people such as Warren Buffett have structured their income tax as far as taxable income by getting invested in tax-free instruments such as government bonds, etc., that are non-taxable for Social Security and, of course, in many cases, non-taxable or only taxed at a much lower rate than if it were working income. So he's right about that. The problem is you could say, let's straighten it all out and let's just tax everything evenly. As soon as you say that, people like Senator Sanders would object vociferously.
Now, how am I going to pay to make certain that public colleges and universities are tuition-free and we substantially lower interest rates on student debt. I pay for that because we're going to ask Wall Street to pay a tax on speculation. We are also believing, I believe, that after the working families of this country bailed out Wall Street, maybe it's their time to help the middle class of this country.
Now, let's stop there because a big mouthful just went by. First of all, we're going to tax on speculation. Depends on what you mean, a tax on speculation, because a lot of retired people are relying on investment instruments for their income in retirement because Social Security can't pay enough of it. The attack that the left likes to do is on Wall Street. And I'll be honest, Wall Street made off like a screaming banshee on what happened. However, what Wall Street did was made possible by the actions of the U.S. government and the Federal Reserve. This is a three-way dance. In 1998, we repealed the Glass-Steagall Act, which had been in effect since 1934, to prevent that very kind of investment debacle that unraveled in 2007. It was passed through a Republican Congress and signed by a Democratic president, Bill Clinton. That was number one. Two, we had things such as the Community Reinvestment Act, which forced banks to make cruddy loans. Who did that? The left, to supposedly help small people. Then you have to pay for all of this stuff. And so how do you pay for it? You pay for it through taxation or through inflation. And it was the inflation of the 90s and into the 2000s on the part of the Federal Reserve that caused this bubble that enabled it all to happen and the crash. Remember, it is inflation that is the wealth transfer mechanism, which transfers the wealth, the buying power of the dollar, from the people out here who work to those who produce the artificially inflated money and to the cronies who work with them, whether on Wall Street or in the Congress, for all of the social spending programs that we have. As John Maynard Keynes said, it is an invisible form of taxation that only one person in 1,000 understands. That's why we have the disparity today. It has very little to do with what corporations offshore are doing. So if you think that they're going to be soaked, think again. It's a three-way game. And when the dust settles and the rules are written, those people will be exempted in one form or another. And the middle class and the lower classes will be held holding the bucket. How do I know that? It's the way it's gone every time we ever try to do this.
That we have an infrastructure that is crumbling. That's roads, bridges, rail, airports, levees, dams. We all know what's happening in Flint, Michigan, water systems, wastewater plants. I believe that if we end this absurdity of allowing corporations who make billions of dollars a year in profits to stash their money in the Cayman Islands, Bermuda, and other tax havens, we eliminate that, we're going to bring $100 billion into the Treasury. That money goes into rebuilding our infrastructure, creating 13 million jobs in 5 years with $1 trillion investment.
Now, once again, he's correct, and then he's wrong in terms of the solution. He's right. The infrastructure is crumbling. When President Obama did the big stimulus giveaways, unlike what Franklin Delano Roosevelt, another Democrat, did in the 1930s, he put that stimulus money into building infrastructure, some of which we have today, which, by the way, is crumbling by now. That's what we should have done. We didn't do that. We gave it away to cronies and sycophants and all that, and we have nothing to show for it. Point number two on this, didn't we have a highway tax at the pump that we pay that's supposed to pay for all these upgrades and maintenances that he's talking about, which we do need to do? Where did those go? Oh, funny. They were siphoned off for all those social programs that we're promoting, the stuff we give away for free. Funny that. However, he's going to bring that money back. How are you going to do that? See, the reason it's over there in the first place is we drove it offshore. And we drove it offshore by high taxes. Well, they're going to take defensive action. Everybody does that. If you think you're going to bring it back by force, they'll just transfer it into some kind of a foreign trust that has no relationship with their American offices, and that's the end of it. You won't get it back here. That's not going to happen. And there's not enough to pay for everything else he's proposing. But understand that what drove us into this situation in the first place was a rising tax rate, a staggered tax rate, progressive tax, which Lenin just loved, and inflation, and it's gotten us where we are. They're proposing more of the same thing. The important thing to realize is that what Senator Sanders is proposing, whereas he identifies a number of problems correctly, the large disparity that we have, which I've spent the last 20 years on the air fighting, the inequality of the taxation system, what you really need is to flatten the tax out. 15%, say, for example, just as a nominal figure. Everybody pays 15, corporations, etc. Soon as you try to level this playing field out and say, let's get it back to something simple and fair, the caterwauling begins. Please don't fall for the idea that we're going to bring all of this money back from the tax people and we're going to rebuild all this infrastructure. I assure you, only a fraction of that money would go to infrastructure. By the time it is fought over and diluted, it just simply will not do that. We're borrowing a third of everything we spend right now. It was government and Congressman Barney Frank telling us everything was okay with Fannie and Freddie just before it blew out. They were all with their hands in this pot to the exclusion of all the rest of us. So he's correctly identifying the symptoms and poorly identifying the causes, and most definitely his solutions. Out of time for today. Coming up next, Section 6 Intelligence Brief.